นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings on this peaceful moonlit night. Some people think that this monastery is the first Buddhist place of worship in this area, this part of Victoria. But actually it's not, it's the second. The first Buddhist place of worship was begun about 150 years ago by Chinese Buddhists who came during the gold rush to look for gold in this area and found some gold as well apparently. And they built a little wooden Buddhist shrine or temple over the hill, the back of the monastery. It's not there now, but it was there long before this monastery began. So Australia and Buddhism have had a slow but sure relationship over the years. Recently we went to visit an existing Chinese temple, monastery, also not far away, about 40 minutes drive from here, so probably our nearest neighbour in terms of Buddhism. And went to say hello, as we sometimes do in the Vasa time, visit other temples and monasteries, Buddhist places of worship. And the senior nun who welcomed us talked to us for a while about the development of their monastery. And I asked her how they overcame the obstacles with building and planning regulations and getting permission and things, as you do when you build monasteries in Australia. But at one point she said whatever the external obstacles they had encountered were, none of them were as important as the obstacles of training her own mind. She just commented that the heart of the Buddhist practice is the training of our heart, our mind. And she had been a nun for many years, so she seemed to understand that very well. So she seemed very wise. But that's true for all of us, whether you're building monasteries or not. You know, the problems of the world is full of problems. The Buddhist term might be dukkha, things that are painful, difficult to be with, problematic. The world is full of problems. But none of them really affect us that much in comparison with our own internal problems or suffering that comes from the effect of the mental defilements, rooted in ignorance, greed, anger, delusion. And Buddhist practitioners who've been doing it for a long time tend to understand this. Nothing more frustrating and challenging than training and developing your own mind in a way that is wholesome and conducive to your peace and happiness. But you can't really solve the problems of the world effectively unless you're putting effort into your own problems, internal suffering and the causes of suffering. Some people have doubts about how they should practice. There's a lot of different Buddhist traditions in Australia, generally divided into what we call Theravada, the kind of Buddhism that is taught and practiced in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, and then Mahayana Buddhism, which tends to be communities founded from China, Tibet, Korea. Of course, they're all coming from the same Buddha, in the same teachings that the Buddha gave, the Four Noble Truths. And each tradition recognizes the main challenge of anyone practicing what the Buddha taught is this mind that gets caught into greed, anger, delusion. And the ways of practice, even though language and culture changes from culture to culture, tradition to tradition, the way of practice doesn't really change. I asked the Chinese nun how she practiced. She said she generally practices a lot of service, looking after the monastery, helping to advise and support the visitors, practicing mindfulness in daily life, and then she developed samadhi by chanting a lot, chanting sutras. And she said when she's chanting, she gets a lot of energy, positive energy from the chant, and the mind becomes very calm. And she found it particularly good to chant when she was facing any kind of fears or anxieties. Focusing her mind on chanting worked for allaying, setting aside fear, anxiety. In the Theravada tradition, we also chant suttas, paritas. We also practice mindfulness in daily life. If you just summarize what we practice, whether you're Mahayana tradition or Theravada, we're cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path that leads out of suffering. Our starting place is a mind, the untrained mind that still suffers, has problems. The goal we're aiming for is the trained mind that has no more problems, no more suffering. The enlightened mind, Nibbana. So even though the cultural, linguistic differences are there, the actual way of practice and the goal of the practice doesn't change. In the time of the Buddha, the very last enlightened disciple of the Buddha, before he died, was Subhata, the monk, has the same name as our teacher Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah was Ajahn Chah Subato. Subhata was the last wandering ascetic who came to see the Buddha just before he died, when the Buddha was on his deathbed. And he had a question. His question was, in other traditions outside of what the Buddha taught, do they have enlightened people? And the Buddha compassionately took his question. At first, Ananda, the assistant of the Buddha, wouldn't let Subhata in to see the Buddha because he knew the Buddha was dying. So he tried to shoo him away. He said, "Oh, don't bother him." But the Buddha heard them discussing whether Subhata could come in to see the Buddha or not. And the Buddha said, "Oh, bring him in, bring him in." So even on the Buddha's deathbed, he was teaching the Four Noble Truths. So it started with the Dhammacakka Sutta, which we just chanted, which led to the enlightenment step by step for Venerable Kondanya. And he finished with the teaching on the Four Noble Truths as well, Venerable Subhata. But once he got into the Buddha's room, he asked this question, and the Buddha said, well, wherever they teach the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path is practiced, then there'll be enlightened beings, Sotapannas, Sakadagamis, Arahants. The four types of enlightened being will be found wherever the Noble Eightfold Path is practiced and developed sincerely. He said if the Sangha practice sincerely, cultivate the Dhamma, the true Dhamma, and keep the training rules, the world will never be free from arahants, never be without arahants. So his very last teaching, he's emphasizing the essential place of the Noble Eightfold Path, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, that we practice. And so all traditions will have that in them, all Buddhist traditions. Outside of Buddhism, well, that remains to be seen. But at least all Buddhist traditions have that at their core. So Subhata, hearing this last teaching, became enlightened. The Buddha said, come forth, become a bhikkhu, became a monk. Whether you're practicing Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, whichever tradition, you're coming back to the training of this mind in the practice of Sila, developing moral integrity, Samadhi, states of calm, Panya, wisdom, insight. Doesn't stray from this. Whatever else you're doing in the world, you may be working very hard, earning money, helping people in society, helping a family, whatever, still doesn't stray from this Noble Eightfold Path. And that's the center of what we're doing. And it's a training. Sometimes it's a good reflection just to bring up, am I still on the path or not? One teacher I used to live with, he said, the Noble Eightfold Path is like the path between two rice paddy fields. In Thailand, when I lived there, in northeast Thailand, everyone grows rice, and the rice paddies have these small little mud walls between them, and you walk along the top of the wall when you're going across the fields, maybe from the forest to the village. There's always a danger because it's muddy and the fields are wet that you might slip off and you fall into the water, which is both embarrassing to your friends, in front of your friends, and also you just troublesome because you get wet. So you have to walk carefully on the top of the dike, off the mud wall, to get across the field. And this teacher said, well, the Noble Eightfold Path is like that. You've got to tread carefully and stay on the path, otherwise you fall into the mud, and that's no good. You fall into the mud, you get muddy, maybe you get hurt, and all your robes get wet. For a Buddhist monk, that's important because you only have one set of robes, and especially in the rainy season when the paddy fields are full of water. If you get even a part of your robes wet, or maybe all of your robes wet, and then you go back to the monastery, you have to eat your meal with wet robes on, because they won't have time to dry. There's no sun in the rainy season, it's just cloudy. And myself, other monks have eaten many meals in wet robes, not necessarily because you fell in the paddy field, but maybe just from the rain. And you have to wait all day to get your robe dry. One of the suffering of monks in the rainy season. Well, in the same way, you have to stay on the Noble Eightfold Path, not to fall off, because when you start to fall off, meaning you no longer training in sila, no longer training in mindfulness and samadhi, no longer training in cultivating insight, then you start to get into the mud of your mind. The greed, the anger, the delusion, and you can't find a way out maybe if you've gone off the path. So we have to keep reflecting, am I on this path or not, from day to day through our life. But it's a useful tool, isn't it? You've got something you can use to reflect on what you're doing, the way you're thinking, your attitudes, what you say, what you do every day, the choices you make. If we didn't have this Noble Eightfold Path, well, where would we be? We'd just be stuck in the mud, lost. But because we do have this teaching, we can use it as a skillful means to train every day. So, we take on precepts, 5 precepts, 8 precepts, or the Patimokkha for a Buddhist monk. And there's plenty, just in that, there's plenty to reflect on, whether you're still falling within the bounds of what we call good sila, living in a moral way, not harming others through your speech or actions. Of course, there'll always be moments when you forget. You lose your mindfulness and you say or do something you regret. The important thing is, are you realizing, picking that up and then trying to adjust? Start again, re-establish your commitment to the sila. Because if you don't, then you tend to pick up bad habits and can go backwards in your practice or just get lost. End up doing all kinds of things that bring you stress, suffering, with you no longer have a kind of a standard guideline for your behavior. What supports that is the practice of mindfulness. So if you meditate regularly, then you'll find, you become aware of what you say and what you do every day. Because as you're training your mind, say, to follow the breath, recite Buddho, or contemplate any other meditation object, or stay with any other meditation object, well, the things you said and done will be coming up in your mind. What happened yesterday, what happened last week, sometimes stuff from 10 years ago comes up in your mind. And the nature of unwholesome, unskillful speech and actions is it disturbs the mind. It's quite hard to move on from or let go of. Often we try to move on quickly in our life, even when we notice we've done something unskillful or said something unskillful. We try to move on. Sometimes we try to cover it over or ignore it, hide it. But our mind is actually a very good record of things. You might call it the law of karma. And the things we say and do leave an impression on the mind. So if you start following more unskillful ways, habits of speech and action, well, they'll come up in your mind over and over again. And sometimes the more peaceful you are, the more effort you put into mindfulness practice and training in developing states of calm, there'll always be that memory or that past action that comes up in your thinking. The mental pain, and occasionally even physical tension, physical pain as well. Sometimes the more peaceful you are, the more likely it will come up to disturb you. When we're not very peaceful, we're thinking a lot, worrying a lot, anxious, or just proliferating, then often we don't notice transgressions against precepts or hurtful things we've said and done maybe. We don't notice because the mind is just too caught up in different trains of thought, different emotions. But if you're practicing mindfulness sincerely, putting a lot of effort in, like when you meditate, and then you notice things, and they'll often come up just when you're getting peaceful as well. Many people have said, oh, just the mind and body settling down, becoming calm, focusing on the breath, letting go of thoughts and memories, not thinking about the future very much, not thinking about the past. And then something pops into the mind, like unfinished business, like a debt. You know, it's like if you go to work and you get your paycheck, you know, oh, I got all this money, but then you realise you still got to pay off a mortgage or pay off a credit card debt. You can't enjoy the money. Samadhi can be like that. The mind is calming down, becoming still, no doubt about it. And then something slips in from the past, maybe, just to disturb that stillness or kind of take away a little bit of your happiness at that moment. That's the power of karma. Maybe just a memory, a train of thought comes up, and you realise, oh, I've been saying or doing something not quite correct. Sometimes it's a visual image, sometimes it's just thoughts, memories. So you have to brace yourself for that as well, or even expect it. It's not sure, isn't it? You're just getting peaceful, but it's not sure, not certain how long that peace will last or how steady the mind will be. Because if you train in reflection and discernment, wisdom, you can use that opportunity. Say something does come up, you can investigate. Say if you didn't keep a precept and you did something unskillful, harmful, well, that's the time where you can learn a lesson maybe and see the disturbing nature of that precept, you know, that time when you killed something, or when you took something that wasn't yours, or when you were insulting, rude, or told something that said something wasn't true, did something that was deceptive. You notice that, and you can make your determination not to continue in that way, to change your habit, change your behaviour. So rather than just moving on without caring or doing anything about it, you do the opposite. You investigate it. You see the disturbance, the suffering it may have caused you. At the very least, if it takes away your peace of mind at that moment when you are becoming peaceful, you'll see maybe the importance of paying more attention to your actions, your speech during every day, because you know it will come back on you. The debt will be, you're building up debts, knowingly or unknowingly, and those debts will come calling on you eventually, just like the credit card people or the bank or whoever. With karma, you don't get away with anything. What we tend to do is blame somebody first. You know, why do I have to remember this? I know I've got faults, made mistakes, but why do I keep thinking of it? Maybe feeling guilty, feeling critical of yourself. But you can use this state of calm if you are meditating, becoming mindful, just to learn something, and rather than getting caught into the aversion to this memory that comes up, or getting caught into the anxiety, teach yourself. The anxiety or the negative feeling that comes up, well, that's something you also have to just be aware of as impermanent. It arises and ceases. But also teach yourself, well, what's causing this? It's come from some action, some event, situation that happened. Try and make yourself really mindful of what's happened so that you can avoid creating the same suffering in the future. This is training the mind. changing the mind. When we're not so mindful, we tend to have this sense of it's got to be like this, there's nothing I can do. But mindfulness releases wisdom, understanding. And you might realize, I can change if I'm determined enough, and when you see the problem, see what you've done where you made a mistake perhaps, you can change. You realize you can change. It doesn't have to be like this. And you have a guideline, you have your state of mindfulness and the peace that comes with it. You realize that's more important than whatever small advantage or whatever you seem to get out of that behavior that led you to do something maybe unskillful, unwholesome in the past. You realize it wasn't worth it. This is better. Being mindful, having a mind that's settled, peaceful is better. So you learn that way. So sometimes we have to face up to mental defilements and the suffering they bring, but face with mindfulness and investigate, develop some understanding rather than just try and run away or block them out, or sit there just feeling sorry for ourselves or angry with ourselves. That doesn't really help either. The Buddha gave us these tools to practice, to develop the mind. Sometimes when the insight arises and you see where you were going wrong in your thinking or your actions in the past, that really leads to a even deeper peace. You realize, now I understand what I have to do, let go of. You get strength of mind, you get peace, you get rapture, you get happiness. Sometimes when you practice with effort, then your mind goes into an even deeper state of calm. You truly let go of that memory or the anxiety around some past action. When you truly let go, it tends not to return and bother you because you know it, you understand. When we're still not very aware, not very mindful, we tend to doubt. So then, of course, we might go back to the same old behavior, same old patterns in the mind, and we haven't really moved on from that problem. We're still stuck with it over and over again, maybe. The Buddhist path, staying on the Buddhist path, is all about looking after your mind, treating it as something valuable. Your peace, your happiness is something valuable, part of your life. But the path that leads to that is valuable. So you have to look after it, put effort into it, learn the Dhamma and then practice it. Any Buddhist tradition will be teaching this. And we still do what we can for the world around us, try and solve some of the problems of the world and build a better world and so on. Of course, do that. But it's not the most important thing. More important is actually what's going on internally. So maybe I'll leave you with those reflections tonight.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.